Witam w surrealistycznym świecie edukacji w czasach koronawirusa. Mam nadzieję, że jesteś zdrowy. This is a presentation to replace session 4 of our Warsztaty pisania tekstów naukowych, or workshops on the writing of scientific texts. This lecture will offer you a case study based on economic and quantitative history that is intended to illustrate the shifting narrative of one field within the social sciences from broad topics aligned with the needs of governments at the beginning of the 20th century through the period of specialization in micro-studies in the mid-20th century back to questions of big data and world history at the end of the 20th century. Now, because you're from various different disciplines, and you may not have experienced any study of quantitative history or quantitative methods in the past, I'm going to give you some basic contextual information so that you can follow what for us is the more important discussion of how the discipline has changed over time. So what are quantitative methods? Well, basic quantitative methods employ quantitative evidence used as a supplementary corrective to a core body of qualitative evidence. So, for example, basic quantitative methods involve the use of sums. I give you examples here in round brackets. For example, in 1943, there were 127 homicides in Liverpool. That's a piece of basic quantitative data. Simple proportions. King Edward spent most of his time dealing with taxation, so simple proportions are most or the smaller part, or complex proportions deal with percents, so these are more specific. 13% of trade was tin, 22% was iron, 65% was copper. Now, this evidence can be noted for a time series such as year after year or decade after decade. And it's the use of these basic sums, simple proportions, and complex proportions in which the origins of quantitative history and quantitative research are grounded. I give you an example here of using a simple quantitative method. So this is total income in British pounds, for an aristocratic family from 1540 to 1590. So it's simply a matter of creating a data series over time. A little bit more about basic quantitative methods. In the 1890s to 1930s, these were far more revolutionary than you might think. The then dominant view of the humanities and social scientists was very much a historicist view that we might associate most notably with G.W.F. Hegel, for example. And Hegel argued that we must understand the past in its own terms. So the social context and the subject's understanding of their own world should be our main concern as researchers. But this was rapidly being replaced at the turn of the century by the competing materialist view, which of course we associate most strongly with Karl Marx. And Marx argued that we must understand the world in terms of tangible, quantifiable things. Now, this is something of an oversimplification of Marx, but it will do for our purposes. Marx argued that there's a narrative in history of tangible people and goods which extends beyond the intangible social context. But Marx really argued it doesn't matter how we as individuals feel about the world around us, because the world around us is something that can be measured. And a good example of comparing the historicist and Marxist views might be as such. We could ask the question of were peasants prosperous in the 1600s? Now, the word prosperous in English means having, it contains a sense of doing well, that positive things are happening in one's life, that one has enough food, enough money to be adequately supplied in life. But prosperity is very much, in Hegel's historicist view, in the eye of the beholder. So a peasant who has 2 pairs of shoes might feel very prosperous. Like they might wake up in the morning and think things are okay. I have, brown bread to eat, and I have 2 pairs of shoes. And so Hegel would have written that this was a prosperous peasant. But of course, a Marxist would say, well, how many pairs of shoes are adequate? How many calories are contained in that loaf of bread? If we look at all levels in society, how many calories are the richest getting or the poorest getting? Now let's look again at this one individual we're researching. Are they receiving at least an average number of calories? Do they have more than an average number of shoes and other basic supplies? We can measure where this person fits. We might find that while that individual felt they were prosperous, if we look at them against the context of all of society, they're in fact quite poor. And so you get very different results if you're examining the world through the historicist Hegelian view versus the materialist Marxist view. Now, the adaptation of these, or really the adoption of materialist Marxist approaches to the social sciences was really a game changer at the turn of the century. One of the first uses of this kind of measurement was arbitrary measurement of the world around us was statistical mapping, which I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Statistical mapping was very important for governments trying to determine where their people lived, what the production capacity of their citizens was, and so forth. The materialist view also capitalized on the first availability of large dependable data sets. This is to say data sets collected by governments specifically for the purpose of answering certain questions about their societies. Marxist materialism, of course, becomes much more important in the eyes of Western academics following the Russian Revolution in 1917. Which tried to take Marx's views and transform them into a means of laying out an entirely new society, an entirely new way of organizing a society and its production. But I need not say more about Marx here. This is an early example of social scientists working with governments. This is a historically very important map created by the U.S. Census Bureau, the United States Census Bureau, based on the 1890 census. And this maps German immigrants in America. The darker areas have a larger number of German immigrants, the lighter areas less. The census was redesigned at the end of the 19th century really to help answer questions like this. Effectively demographic historians and the demographers in the United States Census Bureau were actively trying to create questions that would allow them to produce this kind of research. So this is this early phase when economic or quantitative history, demographic history, and historians are working closely with governments. And maps like this were produced for industrial output, for agricultural output, for different ethnic groups as well as national immigrant groups, for densities of roads, for proximity to railways, for all kinds of things that would then be used by the government for planning in the future. And this process of adopting this kind of materialist worldview and employing academics to help generate data for the state is one that was going on across Europe and the colonial world. Now, I need to give you a little bit more information here so that we can understand the next phase of this relationship between the social science and broader society. Because the next step, really, after the use of this kind of basic data, is that we begin to use metadata. I'll give you these definitions here. Natural data, these are things that are there in the sources to be counted. So, for example, port books list each ship to enter a harbor. There were 12 in January, 13 in February, and 14 in March, and so there are 39 in total. So natural data are data that you can simply count. They're there in the sources, no interpretation is required. Metadata, of course, is data about data. So metadata can exist in a kind of basic form. So these are averages. In this example, on average, 13 ships entered the harbor each month. But more difficult to work with are what we call interpretive metadata. For example, when we group things together, and probably, I think in this group, almost all of you will be using some interpretive metadata at some point in your PhD thesis. So an example of creating interpretive metadata would be crime statistics. So a police log lists arrests for loitering, public drunkenness, rape, and murder. So the criminologist or historian might then write the sentence I give an example here. The police log records 20 arrests for non-violent crime and 4 arrests for violent crime. Now, what's happened here is that loitering, which is when you sort of stand around creating a nuisance of yourself, has been put together with public drunkenness for a total of 20, because we've interpreted both public drunkenness and loitering as non-violent. But of course, rape and murder, we've counted both of those as violent. So we've created these two categories. Now, often, it's not clear to the reader of a book, or particularly these days an article on the internet or a newspaper, how this grouping has been done. And as social scientists, it's really important, of course, for your PhD, or any good research, that you make very clear and transparent how you group things together. Politicians very much like to manipulate interpretive metadata. A good example of this would be the British government in the early 2000s moved what we call gross bodily harm. That's to say, when two men fight in the street and they punch one another, they moved that from the category of violent crime to non-violent crime. And then they went on the television and announced that violent crime had fallen dramatically under the Labour government, when in fact what they'd done was reclassify a lot of crimes into the non-violent category. Now that we've talked about basic quantitative methods, we need to talk about complex quantitative methods. Now, complex methods are ones in which we start with a core body of quantitative evidence as the basis for analysis, and we use qualitative evidence such as personal memoirs or popular opinions from the media and so forth, only as supplementary and corrective to our interpretation of the core quantitative evidence. So this is is really a hardcore materialist method of operating here. Complex quantitative methods very often use metadata. Statistical mapping, as on the earlier slide, could be achieved by grouping people with similar last names into the, quote, German category, and then creating a similar map to indicate where, quote, German people live. But in that instance, a decision has been made by the social scientist regarding which names are sufficiently German in appearance to put in one group or another. In fact, that kind of mapping by ethnic group is something that historians do very often, and naming data, as problematic as that can be, is typically used for that kind of exercise. But that's a form can be a form of metadata. Trends, for example. We can say from 1830 to 1850, the population increased 2% each year, while inflation was 3% each year. So we've identified by looking at the data a trend over time, and then the trend itself is a form of metadata. In fact, when we have a trend, if we have data missing for 1 year, we can then use the trend to estimate what the missing data is. And that's a complex method. Averages and moving averages are another form of complex quantitative method. The average number of violent crimes increased 1% each month. Now, the rise of quantitative methods and economic history go hand in hand. Demography, certain kinds of economics, and certainly economic history and some other allied social sciences all really emerged together in the early 20th century. Now, economics itself as a discipline, of course, predates history. We think of Adam Smith, the famous Scottish economist, as the so-called father of economic history. Although we might keep in mind, of course, that his position at Glasgow University was that of a professor of moral philosophy, because at that time universities were still in this mode in the 18th century of thinking of themselves as institutions conveying various aspects of moral standards and behavior to their students. Economic history, as distinct from economics or history, exists really from about the time of the professionalization of history itself in the mid to later 1800s. And again, we might think of the father of modern history as a discipline being Leopold von Ranke, who of course dies in 1886. Now, if we look specifically within the kind of English language milieu of history and quantitative methods and economic history, it's really the English school of academic thought that gets this underway. Pioneers such as Thurled Rogers and his History of Agricultural Prices in England from 1259 to 1793. Pioneers such as Thurled Rogers really get this off the ground. At that time, of course, the British Empire was the largest and wealthiest political entity in the world, and it very much revolved around the British imperial mercantile economy. And to support that, the London School of Economics was created as a place for the rich children of London merchants and English merchants to get an education specifically in economics within a university setting so that they could go on and continue to perpetuate British economic dominance. The London School of Economics also was set up really in contrast to the older British universities like Oxford or Cambridge, which were still concerned with morality and moral philosophy and religion. The London School of Economics creating the first professorship or chair of economic history in the world, was very much separating itself from what it saw as old-fashioned, less useful university pursuits. LSE was really created to drive the national economy of Britain. The Economic History Society was founded at the London School of Economics in 1926, and originally many of the academics who were members of the Economic History Society and publishing in the Journal of the Economic History Society, the Economic History Review, were themselves working with big companies or government data at some level, at some point. Before 1930, most quantitative and economic history was concerned with national narratives, that is the construction and rise of nation states in Europe and the Americas. Economic history before 1930 was very much an outgrowth of economics, and it relied mostly on simple quantitative methods and natural data. And I hope those terms are now fixed in your mind. But from the 1930s to the 1960s, a radical change took place within economics and economic history. And this paralleled the same kind of radical shift that took place in interwar and post-war history, sociology, and other social science disciplines. There's a gradual increase in quantitative methods beyond just their use in economic history. Really, in the interwar period and the early post-war period, there was a major reassessment of the impact of industrialization and its potential negative consequences for ordinary working people. And this was very much kind of prompted in the West by the fact that the Russian Revolution in Russia in 1917 had been based very much in the popular mind, very much on the dissatisfaction of poor industrial workers with their circumstances in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other industrial hubs in Russia. And so people in the West were asking themselves, okay, what does the sort of statistical, quantitative history of our own working class tell us here in the West? Are we really the good guys? Can we be blamed ourselves for World War I and World War II? And this is a kind of, again, self-re-examination between the wars and after World War II that's happening across all social science disciplines. Now, again, the Annales stole and its focus on the longue durée comes up here because there's a coming together of quantitative and economic history within wider movements like the Annales school of French historians. The Annales school, of course, is very anti-political as a history movement and is concerned with trends such as agricultural output over hundreds of years. Starting with things as basic as the soil. Does the soil dictate the kind of agriculture? Does the kind of agriculture then dictate the position of this village within hierarchies of wealth? Does the wealth of the village then impact its social and political power within governmental structures on a local government basis? And they build up from the bottom like that with long-term trends, very much looking at things like agricultural output, poverty, early industrial output over a very long time span. Again, an anti-political history movement based on this kind of self-reflection following the First and Second World Wars. Now, the big topics here: population, wages, food prices, industrial output, crime, and linkages between them. In the up to the 1960s, we see a dramatic increase in the use of complex quantitative methods. This is the grouping of things and their analysis, and the analysis of those groups in terms of moving averages, in terms of trends, and then using trends and averages to estimate missing data points. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment here. Now, the introduction of computing into history and other social sciences, of course, creates a transformation, a really rapid transformation in the 1960s. And I'd stress here that this isn't just in economic history or history, but also in other social sciences. For example, in sociology, standardized testing of individuals with these kind of tests where you fill in a small circle to indicate your choice of answer, and then sheets of paper with these small filled circles can be fed through a computer, an old style computer, and they can generate averages of how people answer certain questions over hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of participants in a survey, for example, or of school children. And this is the time when we use computing and standard averages to determine things such as the sort of, quote, typical state of one's mental health. Prior to this sort of revolution, we didn't have clear ideas of what, quote, normal mental health was. But if we could survey thousands of people and then use those survey cards for computer analysis, then we could determine, the typical experience of being human. Now, that kind of boom in quantitative research affects economic and quantitative history really dramatically. The use of interpretive metadata increases dramatically. So remember, interpretive metadata is where we group things together. So we look at all of the crime statistics and we say, these 3 kinds of crime we think are violent, these 3 we think are non-violent. Let's compare the 2 over 500 years, something like that. Or not 500 years, but over 500 cities. And then we can create a kind of statistical map of where we have the most and the least violent crime. That kind of use of metadata increases dramatically. A debate emerges as well over how far quantitative methods should go. So a really contentious new direction, for example, is the use of historical projection. If we have a data series and we can see that the data series exhibits a clear trend, we can begin to ask these kind of counterfactual what-if questions. And a good example of this is William Fogle's famous book, Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery. Now, Fogle was a gentleman from the South in the United States, and of course the South in the United States Civil War favored slavery, and we had a very bloody civil war in the United States over nearly 5 years, in which the North invaded the South and defeated it and liberated the slaves. Now, this placed very much a kind of sense of social guilt on the wealthy class in the American South for the following 100 years. And Fogle comes along at the end of that and he asks this question. He says, if there had never been a civil war in America, would slavery have ended anyway? And he argues that based on statistics of the economic output of large farms and the economic cost of maintaining slaves, that in fact, if we had not had a war about slavery in America, slavery would have ended anyway, because slavery was beginning to no longer be economically profitable by the 1860s, and therefore it would have ended anyway. Now that matters from a social point of view, because if you say it would have ended anyway, then it means that the entire war to stop slavery, in which 1 million people are died, many more die and are maimed, and the economy of the South of the United States is destroyed for the following 30 years, and the South still remains relatively poor in the 1970s. All of that was unnecessary. It shifts the blame from the South to the North. So Vogel's book is really controversial for this reason. It uses historical projection based on big data to say that the economics of American Negro slavery was such that slavery would have ended without a painful, violent, destructive civil war. Now, this kind of controversial use of historical projection, where you establish a trend and then ask questions like, what would have happened if we didn't have the First World War? What would have happened to industry A or to the economy of region B if the government had made a different decision at this point, or this point, or this point? That's really controversial. And it drives a kind of divorce and retrenchment. So what we see here is that social scientists, including historians, either fall into the category of being in favor of big data, or they decide that big data is a kind of problem in itself. And the argument here against big data is that the larger the data set, the less possible it is to know the data's origins and nuances. Put another way, metadata is necessary to use large data sets. If you're going to look at an entire region or country or national economy, you can't just count the natural data. You can't just count up the things that are there in piles and piles of documents. It's too much. Instead, you have to use metadata. So you take a sample from area A, you take a sample from area B, from area C, you work out what you think the average for something is, and then you trace that average over a period of time. And so you're always using metadata. You're always separated to some degree from the actual source material. And the argument is that the larger the data set, the larger the use of metadata, the less accurate the results. And so we see in this field the same trend that's observed by observed in the History Manifesto by David Armitage, that a lot of people in the social sciences, both historians and sociologists, shy away from big data and move very firmly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s into the camp of using micro studies, really specific studies of very small groups and narrow aspects, because they feel that they can understand the data and get a better, more accurate result if they're only looking at a small area. Economic history embraces increasingly sophisticated analysis of large sets of data and the use of metadata, particularly in the 2000s. Social history shies away from large data sets and becomes increasingly focused on these narrow, short-term, regionally specific types of research that are complained about so vigorously in the History Manifesto. So economic history and social history divorce from one another. Economic history retrenches itself in what we call econometric methods and big data. What do I mean by econometrics? And this really, it's a form of what we could consider a form of big data. So this has really grown in importance in the last 20 years as a discipline, econometrics, and it's the kind of big data focused approach that is very much favored by the authors of the History Manifesto at the end of their book. Okay, econometrics is also called cliometrics in the United States and Canada, so keep that in mind. Econometrics is the use of mathematics and statistics to analyze economic data. This most commonly employs what we call regression analysis. Now, regression analysis is a statistical method to describe the relationship between two or more variables. For example, the relationship between time and distance, used to estimate the value of a dependent variable based on an independent variable. So let me try and make that clear. One example of econometrics would be the Fisher identity, which has been used to try and analyze pre-modern economies. So the Fisher identity is a mathematical, or any identity is a mathematical formula whereby the material on the left equals the material on the right. In this case, MV equals PT. And when you put two variables next to each other, it means you multiply them. So M, the number of coins in circulation, multiplied by V, the velocity of circulation, how often each coin changes hands, is equal to price level, multiplied by T, the total number of transactions. Now, this formula has been used to explain why if you don't have enough coins, then if you don't have enough coins available in a society, that is to say, in modern language, if you lack liquidity, that the economy will decline, that the economy will shrink. Now, if we do a little bit of algebra here and we move the M from the left to the right, we get V, velocity, the number of times a coin changes hands, is equal to price times the number of transactions divided by the quantity of currency. Now, if you have only a small number of coins available in society, then the frequency with which each coin would have to change hands from one person to the next could potentially, that is to say the velocity, could potentially be higher than can realistically be achieved. So let's say, for example, here something costs one zloty, and you only have, so the price is 1 zloty, and you want to have 4 transactions, so P equals 1, T equals 4, but you only have 1 coin available, then that means P times T, 1 times 4 equals 4, divided by 1, then that coin has to change hands 4 times. Your velocity will equal 4. Is it realistic for the same 1 coin, the same 1 zloty, to move back and forth 4 times to achieve those 4 transactions? Well, that's only possible if if you have 2 people standing in the same room selling something back and forth to each other again and again. What happens if someone in a different place down the street wants to buy something that costs 1 zloty? They can't, because they don't have that coin. That coin is exclusively available to those 2 people who are engaging in transactions up the street. And so that transaction just never happens. And that limits economic potential within an economy. I'll give you an example of regression analysis at work here. The way in which we look at a dependent and an independent variable, and we analyze the relationship between the two. Here we have along the bottom of this graph time, along the left side we have income in British pounds. So this is the example of an aristocratic family's income again. Notice how we have no data for 1595, 1600, and 1605. So we're missing those 3 data points. But if we run a regression analysis and we look at the relationship between time and income, mathematically, we can see that what we have here is a sine wave, right? So this is your typical economic boom and bust cycle. So economies tend to grow rapidly, people overinvest, and then we see the bust part of the economic cycle where it declines, and then when the market hits rock bottom, everything's so cheap, people begin to invest again, and values and incomes go up again. So in this way, we can estimate with reasonable certainty that probably the missing data for 1600 and 1605 are somewhere along that sine wave. And I give you here in the top right the kind of mathematical formula by which that's been achieved. So this is a really powerful tool that allows us to see and to understand the way in which all of these data points relate to one another. The problem is, by the time we're at the level of using regression analysis, we are a very long way from what's actually written in the source material. And this, of course, makes some social scientists very uncomfortable. We have two groups among economic historians now, because even after social historians and sociologists begin to move away from complex quantitative methods and metadata, economic historians push forward into the 90s and the early 2000s when the types of analysis that people are using become so complex that we begin to see a divide even among economic historians. And there are two main groups among economic historians now. Those interested in macro historical topics. So these are those who are using the tools of computing and complex econometrics from the 1990s into the 2000s to look at bigger and bigger and bigger data sets. And for these historians, they now have a very, very close relationship with the government in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in France, for example. These macro historical economic historians are now, again, as they were 100 years ago, they're now again working very closely with governments, using bigger and bigger data sets, particularly to try and project the trajectory of global economies, of the integration of global economies and trade networks, and how those are going to behave in the future to help with government planning. And so this is really a revival of that close relationship between historians and government that we saw 100 years ago. They're interested in the global economy and the analysis of stock markets and economic phenomena. For example, the economic boom and bust cycle I showed you on the previous slide, that is a really basic example of an economic model which is used by people investing in the construction of blocks of flats or houses, or investing in certain companies in the stock market. They're looking to see where they think that sector of the economy or where they think a particular company is on that boom and bust cycle. Now, the second group of economic historians today are revisionists who feel that we absolutely must limit the size of data sets and use metadata to stay in, and limit the use of metadata so that we can stay in touch with the source material. And these include microhistorians using the so-called micro-exemplary model, where they use small data sets and qualitative detail to do really intense and very, very specific studies of, say, one neighborhood in a town, one small village, one small group of companies, one narrow sector of farming in a specific region. Now, this divide isn't going away. We're in a position now where some economic historians are, so firmly entrenched in the econometric camp that they have really begun to sort of shun the small short-term, narrow studies. And really, historians tend to be very emotionally attached to one approach or the other. Sociologists the same, very emotionally attached to one approach versus the other. And in this way, you can see the History Manifesto book as an example of a group of historians that are very much attached to the big data, econometric approach, complaining about those who believe that micro studies and short-term studies offer us a more accurate picture. Now, reflecting this content of this lecture, you can see some major trends in economic history over the last century here. From the 1930s to the 1950s, we were interested in population, wages, food prices, industrial output, and crime. And this is in a period when social scientists and historians were moving away from supporting big government, moving away from supporting the research needs of politicians who favored nation states, and very much pursuing with greater interest sort of the social experiences of communities, and eventually coming to advise very much left-wing politicians in the 1960s. Industrialization was a big topic in the 1950s. Colonialism and economic development was a big topic in the 1960s to 80s. And again, this is part of that kind of revolutionary anti-government approach, in the same way that in the 1960s to 80s, social movements were saying no, traditional government and predominantly white male society has been unfair to persons of color, has been unfair to women. They also said it's been unfair to colonized societies in Africa and South America. And you can see this reflected in the interests of historians in the 1960s to 80s. Economic history and revisionism comes from the 1980s to the 2000s, and now people tend to be looking at globalism, the development of a world economy, and big data as argued for in the History Manifesto. Where will we go in the future? I don't know. I mean, I think it's for you very much to sort of reflect on your own PhD and say, okay, is a short-term approach where I'm looking at a very narrow micro history or micro-analysis of one specific thing, is that where I want to be? Like, is that what I want my PhD to do? I mean, this whole course is thinking about the context in which you create your PhD and the implications that might have for your career. And I hope that this lecture was of some use, and I very much hope that you can now look across the history of your own field of study and assemble the same kind of narrative. Where was it in 1920, 1950, 1980, 2000? Where will it be in a few years? Advantages of quantitative methods. Large-scale, long-run studies are possible. It allows for the study of groups, of masses of the population, or of hundreds of works of art, or of the use of literature and linguistics by hundreds of thousands of people. It can measure changes over time in a way that cannot be perceived through micro-studies. It's been argued that it allows for a degree of precision, but really a very specific kind of precision. Precision in the sense that I can put some hard numbers into a graph that demonstrate a trend. The question is, are those numbers generated in a precise way? So precision is a relative term here. The problems of quantitative methods include predominantly the problem of what we call garbage in, garbage out. If you do a bad job of sampling, if you generate metadata which is not accurately reflective of reality, then the analysis of your garbage metadata will give you garbage results. The quality of historical data is often poor and inconsistent, and so there's questions of whether we should subject all historical data to quantitative methods. There are often reasons that people under-record or over-record certain items when creating government or historical source materials. For example, if you were taking part in a government survey about ethnicity and religion at a time when you expected the government in the future to crack down or be really negative and harsh against one ethnic group or one religion, then you are going to obviously be less willing to be honest on that survey. And so when a historian looks at that survey 100 years later, is it really suitable for quantitative analysis? And this is very much what I mean by numbers are not neutral here. Numbers are not neutral. Now, the use of numbers can produce sweeping generalizations which don't necessarily do justice to the complexities and contradictions of the past. And this is the kind of the Hobsbawmian argument here that if we only focus on big groups and movements, then we're really not accurately reflecting the past. When the alternative point of view might be, well, if a movement is really obscure and only involves a tiny percentage of the population, should we really waste our time looking at it in the first place? And that's a kind of bigger question. Okay, with all that in mind, I hope I've given you enough sort of information here to begin thinking about your own field of study over the last 100 years and its relationship to bigger trends. For example, the movement towards narrow, small-scale studies and the more recent movement back towards big data and broad studies. And really, I want you to just reflect on how you feel about those movements and where you want your PhD to fit within that arc of history. Thank you.